It was March 1997 when the mansion at 18239 Rancho Santa Fe Drive became the scene of one of the most disturbing mass deaths in modern history. The smell came first, a thick, pungent stench of decay that seeped through the walls and lingered in the pristine California air like a malevolent ghost. When authorities entered, they were met with a sight straight out of a nightmare. 39 bodies laid out in perfect rows, each one meticulously positioned on a cot or mattress. They were dressed identically, black tracksuits, neatly tucked shirts, and each pair of feet fitted with the same black and white Nike Decade sneakers. Faces were covered with squares of purple cloth, as though someone had tucked them in for an eternal sleep. But sleep had never looked so grotesque. The bodies had already begun to bloat, their flesh turning sickly shades of green and black, stretched taut over bones as gases built up inside them. Fluids leaked from their mouths and noses, staining the beds beneath them with bile and the remnants of their final meal. The air was thick with it, the odor of rotting belief, of a dream turned into a morbid spectacle. At the helm of this journey into death stood Marshall Applewhite, a man with eyes like hollowed-out moons, his gaze always distant, as if he were already seeing beyond the mortal plane. To his followers, he was Dew, the divine shepherd leading them to salvation. To the rest of the world, he was a madman spinning a cosmic horror story so compelling that it drained the will of his disciples, leaving them as empty shells willing to cast off their own existence. Applewhite's vision of Heaven's Gate was a bizarre fusion of Christianity, sci-fi mysticism, and self-imposed asceticism. He and his partner, Bonnie Nettles, preached that the human body was nothing more than a crude vehicle, a temporary casing that had to be shed in order to ascend to a higher evolutionary state. This, they insisted, was the only path to true salvation. But to reach that state, sacrifices had to be made. For over 2 decades, Heaven's Gate members lived under a regime of extreme self-denial. They surrendered their identities, shaving their heads, and renaming themselves with cryptic nonsensical titles ending in Odie, symbols of their rebirth into Applewhite's vision. They abstained from sex, pleasure, family, and material possessions. Even their meals were reduced to strict, flavorless sustenance. Everything was about control. Their minds, their actions, their very bodies, they belonged to Applewhite. In one of the most chilling examples of devotion, several male members voluntarily underwent castration to rid themselves of sexual urges that Applewhite condemned as hindrances to their ascension. The procedure, crude and without proper medical oversight, left some followers screaming in agony. In one instance, a botched operation resulted in near-fatal blood loss before medical professionals outside the cult could intervene. But none of them wavered. If suffering was the price of transcendence, they would endure it. When Applewhite proclaimed that the time had come to leave Earth behind, no one questioned him. The arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet was the final sign. The spaceship, he insisted, was hiding in its tail, waiting to take them home. But first, they had to free themselves from their human containers. The suicide was carried out in shifts, methodical and eerily calm. The process was designed for absolute efficiency. Each member ingested a lethal cocktail, phenobarbital mixed into applesauce, chased down with vodka. The sedative took hold, slowing their breathing, lulling them into a drugged stupor. To ensure death, they then secured plastic bags over their heads, cutting off their oxygen until their bodies went into violent convulsions. Some clawed at the bags in their final moments, their autonomic survival instincts battling the faith that had condemned them. But there was no escape. Once the first group had died, the remaining members carefully removed the bags, cleaned their bodies, and draped them in purple cloths. Then the next wave followed, repeating the ritual until only 2 people were left to prepare Applewhite's body. He was found on a separate bed, his lifeless face frozen in a grimace of serenity, if madness can ever look peaceful. The last members to die had no one left to cover their faces. They died alone, abandoned in their final moments, their corpses left bare to the world's gaze. Was this truly a mass suicide, or was it something far more insidious? Brainwashing, psychological imprisonment, the slow, systematic dismantling of free will. These were Applewhite's weapons. He didn't need to hold a gun to their heads. He had spent years rewiring their minds, stripping them of autonomy until death no longer seemed like a choice. It was an inevitability. To leave was to risk eternal damnation, to be recycled along with the rest of humanity when the earth was cleansed of its unworthy inhabitants. It was a fate worse than death. And so they embraced their own demise, believing it to be a triumphant ascension. In the eyes of the law, they had taken their own lives. But beneath the surface, the question lingers. How much of a choice did they really have? The world reeled in horror as news footage broadcasted the mansion's interior, a pristine, orderly death chamber where bodies were stacked like offerings to an unseen deity. The matching outfits, the plastic-wrapped heads, the eerie stillness of it all. It was the stuff of nightmares. In the aftermath, loved ones were left grappling with grief and disbelief. Parents had lost children. Siblings had lost brothers and sisters. And yet, even in the face of irrefutable horror, some surviving former members remained devoted to Applewhite's teachings, convinced that their comrades had successfully exited Earth and were now aboard the fabled spacecraft. The mansion was soon razed, but the legend of Heaven's Gate lingers. Even today, the cult maintains a presence. Its website, still eerily active, is tended to by surviving believers who await their own call to ascension. Their existence is a grim reminder that the legacy of Applewhite's doctrine did not die with those 39 bodies. 39 people went willingly to their deaths, believing they were heading toward salvation. But there was no spaceship, no ascension, only silence. Only the sound of plastic bags rustling as their final breaths were stolen. Only the sight of rotting flesh in a mansion that had become a tomb. In the end, they had given everything, including their lives, to a promise that was nothing more than a lie whispered through the void.